I just want to introduce Cyprian. So about a year or so ago, I heard about this yoga retreat happening at this Consiglio monastery, and so it perked my interest a little bit. So I went and, all right, I'll check it out. Well, I was delighted to not only be part of this retreat, but also to know that Cyprian, who's the prior of the Consiglio monastery, New Consiglio in Big Sur, has been studying and practicing and teaching yoga for decades. Spent 10 years in a hermitage near Santa Cruz, and during that time traveled around the world offering retreats and music. He was, before entering the order, he was a liturgical professional musician, traveling and doing that. So he's going to do a little music, and he's written a few books. I'm actually going to bring the book to show, but one of his recent books, Spirit, Soul, Body, on this integration. So he'll be doing some music, sharing some insights, and leave some time for question and answer, and then we'll transition to Mass from there. He's also a priest as well, so does it all.
I will teach you a song we could sing together. We have a monastic community in South India, which we refer to as an ashram, Satchitananda Ashram, the ashram of the Holy Trinity. And one of the wonderful things about being there is they sing these songs from all over India in various languages of India. You know, there's about, I think it's 27 different language groups, and they're singing each other's. Many of them are based in Sanskrit or Hindi. This one, very simply, Hare Yeshu. Can you say that?
Hare Yeshu.
Lord Jesus. Yeshu, Yeshu.
Yeshu, Yeshu.
Hare Hare.
Hare Hare.
Very simply, yeah. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Krishna, Krishna.
Krishna, Krishna.
Hare Hare. That's all there is to it. And nice, big, beautiful things involved. It goes like this. This would be known as a Nama Japa, repetition of the name. So I don't wear this shirt very often in public, but I wore this shirt specifically for you today. I don't know if you can see it from there. Don't tell me, but the first thing Father Cyprian did was take his shirt off. See what that says? He says, this is what a yogi looks like. And I spilled some beef sauce on my pants just to give you the full impression of what a yogi looks like. It's called Yoga and Body Image Coalition. I'll tell you why I wear this t-shirt. I got this from my sisters. My two sisters are both yoga practitioners. My little sister's a little warrior princess, so she's kind of very active, very physical. She's also a stocky little thing, built like my Sicilian grandmother, you know. She does not look like all the ladies on the cover of Yoga Journal. My other sister is in her early 60s, and her body's doing what bodies do in their 60s. It's starting to get sad. And she's out there doing her yoga. She's very active, hiking and things like that. And this organization is about making people feel good about whatever their body looks like. And this is what a yogi looks like. I'm what a yogi looks like. These models and these archetypes that we get placed before us, this is what a yogi looks like. And I'm using that to introduce this theme. I tend to like little framing devices, and this is my favorite one, and if I'm ever famous, I'm going to be famous for this framing device. It comes from the monastic tradition. John Cashin is the great chronicler of the desert monastic tradition in the 4th century. And he and his friend Germanus have come down from Jerusalem to the deserts of Egypt, and they want to meet the great old men. That's back when old man was a compliment. Jared, the wise old guys in the desert. The first guy they ran into is Abba Moses. And they say, Abba Moses, they're here to pursue the spiritual life. And he says to them, what's your, the Greek word, what is your scopos? And they're like, did anybody ever see Monty Python and the Holy Grail? I imagine like this scene, purple? No. And they say, kingdom of heaven? And he says, no, Greek word, that's your telos. What's your scopos? And then he goes on to explain to them, every worthy endeavor has both a goal and an end. The scopos is the proximate goal, and the telos is the ultimate end. That ultimate end could be a little bit lofty and maybe not very practical and incarnate, like the kingdom of heaven. But the scopos is something usually pretty practical, approximate goal that we can reach for. And Abba Moses uses the image of a farmer in his field. The scopos is to till the field and make it ready. The telos is to have an abundant harvest. The easiest example is, for example, in a soccer game or a football game, the goal is to make a goal. The end is to win the game. If you don't mind a violent image, it's also you could win a battle and lose a war. There's the scopos and the telos. And he says your scopos is purity of heart. And then really the rest of this great book called The Conferences is about what leads up to that scopos. And that, we use the Greek word praxis, which would be translated just as practice. And I find that a very interesting word because young people, especially that I know who have kind of drifted off to more alternative spiritual traditions, often use that phrase, spiritual practice. You ask a Catholic, what's your spiritual practice? They're like, chess? It's not really part of our vocabulary. But now I really get it. And I love that word, again, because I'm coming from the monastic tradition, which is essentially an ascetical tradition, a disciplinary tradition. Ascetical not meaning penitential, ascetical meaning it's practical. Ascetical, from the ancient Greek, really means something like an athlete would do. Ascetical practices, what's your practice of the spiritual life? I remember one time I was at our monastery in Rome, San Gregorio Celio, And it was a very funny scene. It was a guy born in Brazil, younger guy, 24, 25, I guess. He dressed like he was off the hip-hopper from the streets of Chicago, but he had this thick Roman accent when he spoke Italian. It was all very incongruous for me. And he was very well trained in yoga, and especially in Kundalini yoga. He did all these breath practices and stuff like that. And he was there kind of trying out the life at our monastery. I was staying there with a friend of mine from Florence who was also a yogi. We were doing yoga in the salons, these Renaissance salons downstairs. And he came up to us and he asked, in his thick Roman accent, "Cosa fanno questi monji?" What do these monks do? There was mass and there was prayers, but what do they do? He had this very elaborate practice, and a meditation practice, a breathing practice, asana practice. He said, "Cosa fanno questi monji?" What do these monks do? You follow that? And I find so many people in this day and age are looking for that really practical thing. What do you do? And especially in Christianity, one of my friends who's a high school teacher here and also practices yoga, he says all the time about in his high school kids, the church does a lot to teach you what not to do with your body. It does not teach you a whole lot what to do with your body. And for me, this is actually the missing piece in Western Christianity. And that's the gift of what we're up to, I think, right here. When I talk about integral spirituality, I mean that. Bringing the whole person in. I'm a little bit ahead of myself. Back to the telos and scopos. Here's something I could talk about for hours, and I'm going to give you just a thumbnail sketch of it. I've done a lot of work in interreligious dialogue. A lot of my friends like to say it's all the same. It's not all the same. Our religious traditions describe the telos in very different ways. Hinduism differs from Buddhism, differs from... You see what I'm saying? That telos, whether it's different or not, I'm not going to speculate. That's the top of the mountain. I'm at base camp. But we describe that telos in very different ways. And we need to, as Christians, as Catholics, hold on to our understanding of that telos. And that's what the bishops tell us in their letters about Eastern meditation. Do those other things as long as you remember what it means to be a Christian. As long as the logic of Christian prayer is kept in mind. And that's what we're talking about a little bit this weekend. But oddly enough, or fortunately enough, where we tend to agree is on the scopos. That's where real conversation can happen. What's that proximate goal? What's that thing we actually can talk about and quite often have in common? One of those things, which again, one of my favorite topics, is this idea of going beyond the phenomenal self. Thomas Bird would call the false self, or the small self, the persona, to our real self. Paul has this beautiful line in the letter to the Colossians, hidden with Christ in God. Our real self. The book of Revelation talks about that white stone that we'll receive that has our name on it. That's our real self. We don't even know who we are yet. But that is one of those things that the religious traditions across the board tend to talk about. There's something beyond this phenomenal self that's a real self. Well, yoga, the yoga tradition, and I'm basing this on the classic Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, put together probably about the 2nd or 3rd century in India. Whole series of aphorisms in 4 different books. Aphorisms are these short little sayings. And I have recordings of them. And the second sutra of all these sutras, first one says, now begins yoga. Second sutra says, yogaha chitta vritti nirodha, which means, you probably heard it this weekend already, yoga is the stilling of the thought waves of the mind. Yoga, chitta is the mind, consciousness. Vritti is thought waves. Nirodha, stilling it. That's the scopos of yoga. That's why we do everything we do to still the thought waves of the mind. Not something I was taught at St. Andrew's Grade School in Romeoville, Illinois. I was taught all kinds of wonderful things. I was never taught that. And you know, that little sentence has a ring of truth to me. When all else fails, my prayer could be that. Stilling the thought waves of the mind. Because, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit in the homily today, there's something beneath my chattering mind. There's something, there's a beautiful poem by Jessica Powers, a bird of beauty singing under my mind. What's underneath that chattering mind is the Spirit. Because our real selves are hidden with Christ in God. So the scopos of yoga, this is what a yogi looks like. Not to be on Yoga Journal with pink tights from Lululemon. Nice abs be nice too, but the scopos, yoga, chitta vritti nirodha. Wouldn't that be nice to have a still, calm mind? For those of us who are prayers, I want a still mind so I can be available to listen to God. Because prayer at some point becomes more listening to God rather than talking to God. That beautiful image in the 19th chapter of the first book of Kings where Elijah goes into the cave. Do you know this story? He's waiting, God's going to pass by the front of the cave. And there's a great firestorm. God was not in the fire. There was a mighty wind. God was not in the wind. There was an earthquake. God was not in the earthquake. And then different translations translate it different ways. Then there was the sound of sheer silence. Some translations, there was a still small voice. It was a phrase very popular in England during World War II. That still small voice. And Elijah went to the cave and bowed. He knew that was where God was. God is in that still small voice. God is in that sound of sheer silence. But I need to still the thought waves of the mind in order to be available to hear the voice of God. And if today you hear His voice, harden not your hearts. Well, the other thing about yoga, though, as I thought about it, the telos of yoga is right in the name yoga. And this is one place, we may disagree about some of the particulars of it, but I think we do agree with the Indian tradition on this, because yoga, as you probably know already, means union. Like the word yoke. And that actually, that's the telos. I want to throw a word in here that's really important for me. And I think especially as a Christian, we believe so much in the working of grace. This is nothing we're trying to achieve. Nothing we're trying to grab at or climb a ladder to. Remember that great hymn from Philippians we sing every Saturday night. Even Christ did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at and clung to. Rather, what did Jesus do? You know the word? Nobody knows? He emptied Himself. At this point in my life, spiritually, it's the most important concept of Christianity, Christian prayer. Emptied Himself. Goes along with nirodha, stilling the thought waves of the mind. He emptied Himself. So, the telos of yoga, I think we could say, is yoga. Union. Not union I'm going to achieve or grasp or work for. It's union I'm going to, a very important word to me anyway, realize. It's union I'm going to realize. The union is already there. I'm just going to be a fundamentalist Christian here for a second and then bang on the Bible, because Jesus already fought that fight. The love of God has been poured into our hearts by the Spirit living in us. Hallelujah. Union already there. If the union with God were not there, we would not be alive. Because God is the ground of being. So anything that exists already shares in the divine that way. Anything that exists. There's a beautiful acronym that one of my teachers use all the time for what this union is. It's actually 4 things. And the acronym is the word SONG. S-O-N-G. Union with self, also very important. Others, nature, and God. Love that. It's pretty comprehensive. To realize our union with ourself. By self, at that point, I mean my inner self, my real self hidden with Christ and God. With others, with whom we are already actually in union. This is one of Thomas Merton's latest teachings. We have to realize what we already are. We are already one. At many different levels, but at least at the psychic and spiritual level, we are already one. Nature. Again, one of those things we could talk about for a weekend, if not a month. We are already in union with nature. Whatever Mother Earth is breathing is going in our lungs. Whatever we put into the earth, we're putting into our bodies. Whatever we're doing to her, we're doing to ourselves. We are already one. And Paul's letter to the Romans, which we're going to be reading next week at liturgy, all creation is groaning and in agony while we work out this redemption of our bodies. And just look at what's going on the planet. The reason the planet is in crisis is because we're not in touch with our own bodies. We're not in touch with material reality. We have not realized our union with material reality. And that not only are we intrinsic to nature, but especially, again, a whole other topic, the evolution of our consciousness, the transformation of our consciousness is affecting the very course of evolution right now. And we think we're going to find solutions to our crisis with the same consciousness that got us into the problems. We're not. We need to transform our consciousness, and the very earth is dependent on that transformation of our consciousness. And I would say, we're not going to transform that consciousness until we dig deep to the core of our being, to the ground of our consciousness, which is none other than the divine. That's the engine of transformation. And then ultimately, S-O-N-G, God. To realize our union with God. A union that's already there in some way. Already there in some way. I'm just watching my time as well. The story of the fall, of Adam and Eve, is fascinating. The myth of the fall. And when I use the word myth, I don't mean something that's untrue. I mean another way of telling a truth. A symbolic way of telling a truth. What happens in that story after the fatal apple and Adam blaming Eve for Eve blaming the serpent? What happens after that? Notice, all the relationships fall apart. All the relationships fall apart. They're hiding from God. So because that relationship with God has broken, all the other relationships crumble. And there's a book written with just this title by a Trappist monk called "Who Told You You Were Naked?" 2 times in the story of the fall it says they were naked but they were not ashamed. So the first lapse, they're out of touch with their own being. They're now ashamed of their bodies. That's a result of the fall. Man and woman are now going to be antagonistic with each other. That's a result of the fall. The woman now is having pain in childbirth. There's another union. And they're going to have to beat on the ground to make it produce fruit. All the relationships have broken because that one essential relationship was broken. Do you follow that? To me, that's the moral of that story. So everything after that is about how do we heal that? How do we realize that union again? I'm going to leave some time for questions too, but you with me so far? Okay. I found myself quite often no, I'm going to take that back. I have several times found myself in a defensive posture about Christian yoga. Fewer times than I would have thought, actually. But here's one of my standard explanations of it. And I get this image from wonderful spiritual writer named Ronald Rolheiser. His book, The Holy Longing, was one of the best things I had read up until that book was written. And I still would recommend it. He talks quite often about physicality, and he talks so beautifully about eros. Eros is this divine energy of creativity that's inside of us. And he also talks about the soul being, I think the word he uses is an energy and a container for the energy. The soul is both energy and something that holds the energy. Now I'm going to take that image and open it up a little bit with due respect. Our spirituality itself is that as well. Our spirituality is, I want to start out with the energy, and I want to call it a fire. First of all, our spirituality is this fiery energy, longing for God, desire for God, creativity that gets poured into our hearts by the Spirit living in us. Our spirituality is that energy, and that energy needs some kind of I like the word vessel better than container, because container can have a lid on it. The vessel instead kind of holds it. So our spirituality is the fire, that energy, and it's also something to hold that energy. Without the energy, it's a dead vessel. I don't know if you've ever been in a place where it was like all container and no energy. Like 7 o'clock mass at many churches you go to. A whole lot of vessel, ain't a whole lot of energy there. On the other hand, I'm thinking to myself from 17 to 40, I was all energy and no container, Maybe men are worse than this, or women, but no container for it. So finding that, and I even find this is my challenge as the prior of our community, that balance. How much energy, how much container, how much fire, how much vessel do we need for that fire? Vessel that can hold it without squelching it. But energy that keeps it alive without burning the whole place down. That balance is maybe a lifelong balance. My favorite image of that is from the book of Exodus. Moses meets God in a burning bush, unconsumed by the flame. Is that a great image if you think about it? I made a 2-week retreat at a hermitage in the desert, and she had this beautiful picture of the burning bush right in front of the chapel. I love to see that every day. That's the best image to me of spirituality. It's this burning bush that holds the flame without being consumed by it. There's our spirituality. Another image of it on another mountain is Jesus at the Transfiguration, standing there with Moses and Elijah. And suddenly, he's all lit up. He's become the burning bush. His whole body, his whole being, Jesus has become the burning bush. His whole being is the vessel that holds the fire without being consumed by it. Track a couple centuries later, this is a great story in the monastic tradition where some guys like Germanus and Cassian go up to a monk and say, "What should I do? I keep my fast, I say my prayers." And Abba holds his hands out and flames shoot out, and he said, "If you want, you could be all fire." The whole point is we're supposed to become that burning bush. Because what's promised to Jesus is also promised to us in that sense. Paul says later to the Philippians, we're waiting for our Savior, our Lord Jesus Christ, who will transfigure our bodies into glorious copies of His. This is an image to keep in front of us, this burning bush that Jesus was, that we're supposed to become. because our whole beings are both that vessel holding the fire. But I would say also our practical spiritualities are both those things. We bring in all this energy and we're looking for some kind of a vessel, something to hold it. And you'll know there are many different spiritualities in the church. You are experiencing Ignatian spirituality right now. Perhaps a variation on it that's brand new. There's Franciscan spirituality. I'm from the Camaldolese Benedictine spirituality, so not just Benedictine, but specifically Camaldolese. We have our own kind of vessel to hold the energy of the monastic life. What I'm suggesting, and I can just attest to this with my own life, yoga makes a pretty nice container for my energy. My energy is, I love Jesus. I'm so devoted to the gospel. So that doesn't diminish at all. And I'm Italian-Irish Catholic to my DNA. To my DNA. It could be anything but a Catholic. But I don't have to do it like every other Catholic does it. I found that the yoga tradition wound up being a brilliant, lovely vessel for my Catholic Christianity. And the main reason why, and I think I'll sum up with this and leave you some time for questions. This gets back to the telos. One of the funny things about classical yoga anyway, and I hope this isn't too nerdy of a philosophical term for you, is classical yoga is actually very dualistic. It's kind of strange. The end of yoga, according to Samkhya philosophy, upon which everything is based, they call it kaivalya, is the separation of consciousness from matter. You'll even read, consciousness and matter have made this marriage and it has to end in an amicable divorce. Separate consciousness from matter. And a yoga teacher, a philosopher told me this, yoga is a dualistic tradition. Now along comes Tantra, Kundalini Yoga, and they're going to bring it back together. But most people don't realize yoga is actually a dualistic tradition and wants to separate consciousness from matter, which I think is so ironic because it's the most incarnate practice I've ever run into. Whereas Christianity, and I mean strict biblical Christianity, is the most incarnate spirituality I run into anywhere. And yet our practice is so disincarnate. Our practice is all from the cheeks up. I would refer to Gregorian chant that way. My problem with Gregorian chant is it's all cheeks up. There's no rhythm, there's no harmony, there's no... not the way our monks sing. We sing like a drunken brawl down by us. A famous author came once, Henry Nouwen, he says, "You have very bold voices," he said. Problem is our Christian spirituality is cheeks up. There's a very famous... I want you to note how many times I'm quoting the Bible here, like a fundamentalist. Talking about yoga. Wonderful. He's considered the greatest scripture scholar alive. N.T. Wright from the evangelical side of the Anglican tradition. I love his works. And he says this great line, and he got in trouble for it, because the headline in the newspaper was, "Anglican bishop says souls don't go to heaven." It's not what he said. And he used my secret word. He said, the idea that the telos of the Christian life is for the body to die and the soul to go to heaven. The telos of the Christian life, for the body to die and the soul to go to heaven, hopelessly misleading. According to Scripture, the telos of the Christian life is the resurrection of the dead. Is the resurrection of the body. Now, even if that's a myth and not something scientific that we can figure out with a chemical formulation, the point of that is the body somehow shares in the glory, according to Christianity. The telos, he says, of Christian life is eschatological reintegration. That everything comes back together. St. Paul has this line at the end of the 15th chapter of the letter to the Corinthians, which is a chapter all about death. This is a line that blew Teilhard de Chardin's mind. It still makes me weep. God will be all in all. All in all. The telos of Christian life is eschatological reintegration. The telos of Christian life mentioned 3 times in Scripture, once in Isaiah, once in the letter of Peter, once in the book of Revelation, just before the end of the whole Bible, is a new heaven and a new earth. We need a spirituality that reverences that and embodies that. That's what we're looking for. That was everything I was going to say. You all look like I just sprayed you with a fire hose. Anything I can clarify by that, or something I could clear up for you? Other things that come up? No. Crystal clear? Rebuttal?
You present it so clearly, so you present it so all this information, thought process in a way that's followed. So it's a lot of, you hit us with the fire hose. A lot of information. Thank you.
Most welcome. I'm going to add one more thing to this. This is from the one really fierce criticism I got from a priest in the UK who sent an email off to me saying, why are you and your friends teaching people a false religion, encouraging other people for a false religion as well? And I wrote him back as politely as possible, also saying, I don't think you're actually expecting an answer, but I'm going to give you one. And one of the things I told him, something I learned from Houston Smith, who was the great scholar of interreligious dialogue, who just passed away a couple of years ago, wrote the book, it's usually called The Religions of Man, Religions of the World, I think is the new form of it. He was talking about Taoism, and again, he gave this framing device that actually wound up working for me across the board in interreligious dialogue. I had experienced Taoism because I had read the Tao Te Ching, which is a book of philosophy and poetry, really. And when I went to Singapore and Malaysia, I kept talking to people about something we have to learn from Taoism. And their eyes are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. They had never read the Tao Te Ching. They thought I was talking about ancestor worship and shamanism and all kinds of things like that. And I had never experienced that part of Taoism. I didn't realize that Taoism in that part of the world was more a devotional thing, with offering incense sticks to the deities and things like that. So I had to back up, and then Houston Smith luckily came along after I had blown it, telling me that there's three different kinds of, telling in this talk, there's three different kinds of Taoism. There's philosophical Taoism, there's devotional Taoism, which does have some roots in shamanism even. And then there's, he called it Taoist yoga, or Taoist science. And that's where like Feng Shui and Qigong, Tai Chi, Chinese herbal medicine, acupuncture, all that comes out of actually the Taoist tradition. Most people don't realize that, and I hadn't realized how much it had as well. So there's that, there's the devotional aspect, and then there's the philosophical aspect, which apparently most Taoists don't read, just nerds like me. So, I realized that really can apply across the board, and I explained to this priest in the UK the same thing. I said there are these three different ways you can approach a religion. There's the devotional aspect, and I never practiced the devotional aspect of Hinduism. When I'm in a Hindu ashram, I do not sing to Krishna, I do not sing to Shiva, I do not sing to Hanuman. I don't even actually take what's called the prasad, the food that's offered to the idols, because it's mentioned right in Psalm 16 that we shouldn't, but especially if they know I'm a Catholic priest and a Christian monk, I'm not going to cause scandal. It's just not our way. I don't do that. But the practical aspect, the science, the yoga, yeah. And actually our church not only allows it, even kind of encourages it. Pope Benedict himself wrote a letter about that, saying other religions who have sought union with God have also found ways toward that union with God. And just because those ways are not Christian doesn't mean we can't take them up as long as the Christian conception of prayer is kept in mind. So we can borrow those beautiful techniques that other traditions have learned. And I mean, thanks be to God, I thank God for Buddhism and yoga who have taught me how to use my mind and how to use my body in my spiritual life. And the things I've learned about diet from those traditions, instead of, you go to a Christian retreat house and you're eating fried Twinkies, you go to a yoga place and you're eating kale, and hibiscus juice, and well, what I eat in the morning affects how I pray in the evening. And then there's a third aspect, the philosophical aspect. And again, the Church at faculty encourages us to explore the philosophical resonances that we have with other traditions. This is where the dialogue happens. Not to say it's all the same, but at least to have a conversation. Because we recognize that there are seeds of the truth scattered everywhere. And that wherever they come to flower, we believe the flowering of any truth is going to reveal Christ to us as well. I'll leave it. Let's do one more little song and then we can get ready for Mass. Okay? Anything else? Basta, finito. You could sing this one too. Jesu, Jesu.
Jesu, Jesu.
JJ Namo.
JJ Namo.
I'm going to change. Let me do a different song. Sorry, I'm going to do the guitar, Bobby. Huh?
Yeah, get that.
Oh, yeah. Spirit in the cave of the heart.
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 Grant us your grace.
Grant us your grace.
Grant us your grace.
Grant us your grace.
Here's the two lines together. Listen. Spirit in the cave of the heart. Grant us your grace.
Spirit in the cave of the heart. Grant us your grace.
Grant us your grace.
Grant us your grace.
Spirit in the cave of the heart. Grant us your grace.
Spirit in the cave of the heart. Grant us your grace.
Grant us your grace.
Grant us your
Oh, come on. Fire. You got that note. Grant us your grace.
Grant us your
Grant us your grace. Grant us your grace. Put those two lines together. Listen. Grant us your grace. 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 Don't be afraid to make a mistake. It's just music. I'm going to sing it once and you answer me every time. Spirit in the heart, grant us your grace. in the heart.